my today's talk will be, as you already said, on digitality, virtuality, and information. And what I'm going to do is to sort of clarify these concepts, especially the conception of digitality, which is a rather new word or concept, so to speak, but also virtuality, because I think that there's deep confusion about what virtual reality actually is in comparison to mere simulation. That was a question that came up yesterday after a talk, and I will really discuss this topic in this following talk. So the outline of my talk is, first, I want to say something about the opposition, the difference between digitization and digitality. I think this is a very crucial difference. Then I will differentiate between simulation and virtuality, which is in a way similar to the distinction between digitization and digitality. Then I will discuss what David Chalmers has recently called a virtual realism and a virtual digitalism. I think that is really helpful, but it's not quite what I think is true. Then I will discuss the role of the internet as what I call a paradigm of digitality. I think it's a really interesting phenomenon. It's not just a medium, it's something more, much more important than a mere medium, the internet. And finally, I want to develop and also propose for discussion 3 categories of digitality as I understand it. First, what I call ubiquitous presentism. Second, transsubjectivity. And finally, what I call inter-objectivity. I think that these 3 categories grasp the phenomenon of digitality in an adequate way, in opposition to mere digitization. So I think that we need new concepts to understand, to grasp the new phenomenon of digitality in opposition to the mere technical phenomenon of digitization. So let's come to the first point, digitization versus digitality. So how can we talk about digitization philosophically, strictly speaking? I mean, as a technological phenomenon, we can, of course, talk about this phenomenon philosophically, but strictly philosophically speaking, I think that we need to find a middle ground between 3 positions that are very prominent, very important in today's discourse. First, what I think we need to avoid if we want to speak philosophically about digitization is ideology. So some people, especially those that hold the Silicon Valley ideology, as Julian Nieder-Rümelin has called it recently, they conceive of digitization as a kind of salvation, as a promise of salvation, also in terms of transhumanism and so on. I think that's the wrong way to philosophically speak about digitization. Then also I think that reductionism, digitization as a mere technical tool or simulation falls short. And finally, what I call discrimination. Digitization is a danger to modernity. So all these skeptics about digitization, I think that's not the most philosophical thing that we can say about digitization. So what is my alternative? I think that all 3 positions fall short because they do not distinguish between digitization and digitality. They also fail to conceptually grasp the life-worldly significance of digitization as a phenomenon of its own kind. And I think that's especially important. It's a phenomenon of its own kind. What does that mean? A phenomenon of its own kind. So digitization is a technical process that is taking place in various areas of society, business, politics, science, education, and so on, the university, and that transforms them disruptively. I think it's really interesting. It's not just a transformation. It's a kind of revolution. It's a disruptive transformation. And that's really interesting, but we can go further, philosophically speaking, because digitality concerns the life-worldly significance of these disruptive transformations as phenomena of their own kind and constitutes, therefore, an own ontology with own laws. And what I'm going to do is to sort of describe and outline this an own ontology and its own laws. That is my approach to digitization in a philosophical way. Therefore, digitality is an anti-reductionist approach to the phenomenon of digitization, beyond mere reductionism, beyond transhumanism, ideology, and beyond other competing views on this phenomenon that I outlined before. So let's come to the next point, the difference between simulation and virtual reality. I think that is really important to understand this difference in order to do justice to the phenomenon of digitality. The Oxford Handbook of Virtuality says, I quote it, "Currently, there is widespread ontological confusion about virtual reality and its relation to the real world, which contributes to a flawed understanding of virtual reality and its potential." I think that's a really interesting diagnosis because there's really deep confusion. So first there's virtual reality in its strict sense, and then there is VR and AR. VR, virtual reality, as VR and AR, augmented reality. So I distinguish virtual reality from VR and AR. I think it's not the same, and it's really important to distinguish between these three phenomena. So VR is a sophisticated simulation of reality that might help us in different contexts. It's really helpful, a technological, interesting thing also in terms of computer games and so on, but it's a simulation. At the end, it's a simulation. AR, in my opinion, we can discuss these things afterwards, is a combination and integration of virtual and physical reality, but opposed to VR. VR is, in my opinion, a mere simulation, a very sophisticated one, but it's not reality. It's not supposed to be reality, basically. So I think that's important to distinguish these three concepts. And now I come to speak about what David Chalmers has recently called a virtual realism and a virtual digitalism. So he says a virtual realism consists of these four propositions. First, virtual objects really exist. Second, events in virtual reality really take place. Third, experiences in virtual reality are non-illusory. Four, virtual experiences are as valuable as non-virtual experiences. So the fourth point can be regarded as a kind of normative proposition. And he also has coined the notion of virtual digitalism. There are two propositions that he gives. First, virtual objects really exist and are digital objects. Second, events in virtual worlds are largely digital events that really takes place. I find this interesting because what he's doing is basically linking virtuality to reality. And I think that's right. But I don't agree with him in his notion, his conception of virtual digitalism, because I think that there are also virtual objects that are not digital objects. That's not the same. There might be virtual objects that are not digital objects. And there's another quote from David Chalmers. He says, "The large majority of philosophers who have written about virtual worlds are virtual irrealists. More specifically, they hold that virtual worlds are fictional worlds. We might call this view virtual fictionalism." Second, another quotation, "Virtual reality is a sort of genuine reality. Virtual objects are real objects, and what goes on in virtual reality is truly real." So I totally agree with him, but not in his thesis that virtuality is necessarily linked to digital objects, because this is his new recent article in 2017, because the Oxford Handbook of Virtuality rightly stresses that, quote, "Despite its recent connection to the digital domain, the virtual has a long bloodline concerning its relationship to the real and the actual, and that ideas and applications of modern digital virtuality are mere late arrivals to the party." So I would say virtuality has a much more longer history than digitality or digital virtuality. So I will give some examples for virtual reality that is beyond digital virtual reality. For example, chess, banknotes, currencies, companies, institutions. These are all in a sort virtual realities because they are not materially, they do not just consist of material objects, but they depend on intersubjectivity and agreement and rules and so on. So these are virtual realities that are not digital ones. Sure, there is a huge area of virtual digitality, for example, bitcoins, virtual objects in computer games, online role-playing games, online exams, Twitter discussions, esports, and last but not least, Zoom conferences, what's going on at the moment. So these are all phenomena, events or objects. We can distinguish between events and objects of virtuality, of digitality, and so on. So let's distinguish between simulation and virtual reality. The relationship between digitization and digitality corresponds to the relationship between simulation and virtual reality. Virtuality must be distinguished equally from simulation and fiction, although it has something in common with these other phenomena like simulation and fiction. So simulations are only model realities, while virtual realities are realities in their own right and have their own ontology. So let's distinguish between fictional versus illusory objects. Fictitious objects do not need a reference to a real model. They are in a way independent. This is creativity. This is the freedom of the inventor. Illusory objects, however, refer in a false way to a real model. So they are not real and also not fictional. This is a distinction, and then we can distinguish between simulations and virtual objects. Simulations are dependent on their real-life model and have no independent factual reality and causality beyond its mere purpose of simulating reality. Virtual digital objects realize their models in a different way. They are no longer dependent on their ontology, like simulation or their structure, but unfold their own autonomous causality, so to speak, an ontological life of their own, which obeys its own rules and thus concerns the realm of digitality, as I understand it. So now we can distinguish, or we should strictly distinguish between reality, virtuality, simulation, fiction, and illusion. And I'm giving a short overview. This is just a proposition. We can discuss this afterwards. I think that there are different kinds of reality. There's physical reality, there's mental reality like thoughts and emotions, perhaps numbers. I'm not sure. We might also have another category like numbers, ideal objects, so to speak. And there's finally virtual reality. This is like just a kind of reality. And on the other hand side, we have irreality, which consists of fictions, simulations, and illusions. So we can clearly see that virtuality has nothing to do with simulation, because simulation is a kind of irreality, whereas virtuality is a kind of reality. So this is a suggestion for clarification between these interesting but different concepts. Let's talk about the virtuality of digitality. So here are some examples for digital virtual objects. And this is the blue party hat in the online role-playing game RuneScape, which is worth almost $1,700 US. You can see that the blue hat is an object of its own. It's in a way a simulation. It simulates a real head, blue head, but it's also a kind of fiction because no real head looks like that. So there's a combination or fusion between fiction, simulation, and virtuality. Basically, it's a virtual digital real object, and it has really high worth. It's really not very cheap. It's expensive. So there are other more expensive examples. For example, in Second Life, in this online role-playing or online multiplayer game, Amsterdam is worth $50,000 US. You can buy it basically. It's not just an object, it's a structure, it's an area. And finally here you can see and this massive multiplayer online first-person shooter, Entropia Universe, the Crystal Palace, and Club Never Die is worth over 300,000 US dollars. Now, these are not just simulations. These are real entities, but virtual entities that you cannot touch, but you can interact with them. And they have an own causality. They have an intersubjective role they play in an own world, a virtual world. These are three examples that, in my opinion, illustrate the potential of virtual reality. Now I want to talk about the internet as what I call a paradigm of digitality. So in his book on the internet, Hubert Dreyfus rightly writes, in my opinion, he quote, "The internet is not just a new technological innovation. It is a new type of technological innovation, one that brings out the very essence of technology." So the internet sort of transcends technology, or it grounds technology. And for this reason, I would argue that the internet is not a phenomenon, not so much a phenomenon of digitization, but rather of what I call digitality. It's the paradigm of digitality, as I shall argue. So there are some reasons for my opinion. First, the internet is what I call a second order medium. What does that mean? It is not a medium, not so much a medium, but the condition or possibility of mediality as such. It grounds mediality. It makes mediality possible. It's an infrastructure that allows people to medially interact and so on. Third, it has become a basic need like water, electricity, and heat. It's a basic structure of our life. It has a life-worldly significance, a really important significance. And finally, it is a context of freedom in which virtual reality takes place. It's really the ground. It grounds virtual reality. It makes it possible. Let's introduce three categories of digitality, digitalia, so to speak. If digitality denotes a sphere of its own that cannot be reduced to the mere technical side of digitization without ontological loss, then we need categories of their own to comprehend it, to grasp it. And I already said there are three of them: ubiquitous presentism, transsubjectivity, and finally inter-objectivity. What I'm going to do is to illustrate these three categories of digitality as I understand them. First, ubiquitous presentism. Space and time play a different role in the realm of digital virtual reality than in the physical world. We can see that from the example of the internet. The internet deeply connects things in a new order. Digital objects are placeless insofar as they stand in horizontal relations of networking, like in the internet. Informational networking. As informational relation, these networks are not stable, but subject to permanent change. So it's not a stable structure, but a really, really dynamic structure. And finally, the time of digitality corresponds to what McTaggart has called the C-series of time. So there's a new order of time. It's just relations. It's not later and before, but it's order, a logical way of time, so to speak. And this together, its temporal logic and its spatial logic can be brought together in the notion of ubiquitous presentism. It's a new kind of space and a new kind of time that we encounter in digitality, especially in the internet. The next category is what I call transsubjectivity. We can understand transsubjectivity as a kind of externalization of thoughts according to its logic of space and time in this ubiquitous presentism. For example, Facebook is a kind of medium that externalizes subjective states such as feelings or opinions, thoughts, so other. Mental contents, ideas, thoughts, opinions, feelings can in principle be absorbed by the hypertextual structure of digitality as a carrier substance, so to speak, and detached from the individual who produced them. So we can share our thoughts. So the structure of sharing that the internet allows us to do is can be grasped by the notion of transsubjectivity. this kind of desubjectivization of mental contents through the structure of division, sharing, networking, and mediation is what the internet allows us to do. And this is a phenomenon of digitality in opposition to the mere technical process of digitalization. Finally, my notion, my concept of inter-objectivity that I want to propose. Digital objects stand in much more intimate relations to each other than physical objects do. So we heard that yesterday, the Internet of Things. So there's an exchange of information, not only between subjects like persons, but also between objects, the Internet of Things, but also between persons and objects, smart objects, so to speak. So in the Internet of Things, objects communicate as they exchange information. And we take part of this communication. And therefore, the split between subjects and objects is increasingly eliminated. So there's a sublation, so to speak, between this difference between subjects and objects. And this is what I call inter-objectivity, and which is, in my opinion, a really crucial dimension of the sphere of digitality in opposition to mere technical phenomena that can be reduced to digitalization. So thank you very much for your attention.